Sahana vavatu, sahano bhunaktu, sahaviryan karavavahai, tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Good. Welcome back to our weekly Bhagavad Gita class. We continue on our study of Chapter 2. We've just begun the topic of Karma Yoga. We'll begin our recitation today with several verses, beginning with verse 39. Please glance at the meaning while I'm chanting so that you can recite after me with the meaning. Esha te behita sankye, esha te behita sankye, buddhir yoge tvamam shunu, buddhir yoge tvamam shunu, buddhya yukto yaya partha, buddhya yukto yaya partha, karma bandham prahasyasi, karma bandham prahasyasi, neha bikramana shosti, neha bikramana shosti, pratyavayo na vidyate, pratyavayo na vidyate, swalpamapyasya dharmasya, swalpamapyasya dharmasya, trayate mahato bhayat, trayate mahato bhayat, vyavasayatmika buddhir, vyavasayatmika buddhir, ekeha kuru nandana, ekeha kuru nandana, bahushakahyanantascha, bahushakahyanantascha, buddhayo vyavasayinam, buddhayo vyavasayinam, yami mam pushpitam vacham, yami mam pushpitam vacham, pravadantya vipashchitaha, pravadantya vipashchitaha, Vedavararatha partha, Vedavararatha partha, Nanyadastiti varinaha, Nanyadastiti varinaha, Kamatmanah Swargapara, Kamatmana Swargapara, Janma Karma Palapradam, Janma Karma Palapradam, Kriya Vishesha Bahulam, Kriya Vishesha Bahulam, Bhogaishvarya Gatem Prati, Bhogaishvarya Gatem Prati, Yes. Bhogaishvarya prasaktanam, Bhogaishvarya prasaktanam, Tayapahrita chetasam, Tayapahrita chetasam, Vyavasayatmika buddhihi, Vyavasayatmika buddhihi, Samadhau na vidhiyate, Samadhau na vidhiyate, Traigunya vishaya veda, Traigunya vishaya veda, Nistraigunyo bhavarjuna, Nistraigunyo bhavarjuna, Nirdvandvo nitya sattvasto, Nirdvandvo nitya sattvasto, Niryogakshemahatmavan, Niryogakshemahatmavan. We'll stop there and pick up the thread. We finished verse 41. So we'll begin today with verse 42. The context, as we discussed in the previous class, where you have several verses here to introduce the topic of Karma Yoga. The topic of Karma Yoga actually begins with the famous verse 47, karmanyevadhikaraste ma paleshu kadachana. Everyone quotes that and mistranslates it. We'll see that soon. So these verses are introducing the topic of karma yoga. And as I mentioned in a previous class, we're first, Sri Krishna wants to make sure we understand what karma yoga is not. And I mentioned in a prior class a common confusion with regard to the word karma, at least a common confusion in ancient times, when karma meant Vaidika karma, Vedic karma, Vedic rituals. The word karma was frequently used in a sense of Vedic rituals in ancient times, and Sri Krishna wants to make it really clear that karma yoga is not the performance of Vedic rituals. In fact, as you'll see, he's highly critical of the excessive focus on ritualism. The same complaint that many people have today about Hinduism, Sri Krishna himself had the same complaint about Hinduism as commonly practiced many thousands of years ago, several thousands of years ago. In this context, at the end of the last class, I made a differentiation between two sections of the Veda. I want to remind you about that twofold division. We can divide the Vedas in several ways. There are 4 Vedas, each with their own name. But within each of the 4 Vedas, there are 2 broad sections. There are other ways of dividing up as well. But the 2 broad sections are Karma Kanda and Jnana Kanda. Kanda means part, portion. Karma Kanda is the portion of the Vedas devoted to karma. Remember, karma here means rituals. And then at the end of each Veda is a small part, which is the Jnana Kanda, the part of the Veda devoted to jnana, spiritual wisdom. Because those portions occur at the end of each Veda, they're called Vedanta, Vedanta. So we talked about that in the prior class. So here, Sri Krishna is going to criticize those who are excessively focused on the karma kanda of the Veda, those who ignore the jnana kanda of the Veda. And before we proceed, one point, I'm not sure if I made it clearly in the last class. It's an important point. The performance of Vedic rituals was done for the sake of specific goals. In fact, we did talk about the first 3 of the 4 Purusharthas, gaining kama, pleasure now, gaining artha, wealth, so that you can enjoy pleasure for the remainder of this life, pleasure or contentment. And then dharma, accumulating religious merit, so that you could enjoy pleasure and contentment in whatever state follows this life. The point I want to make before we plunge in here is that the performance of Vedic rituals were for the sake of that pleasure and contentment. Pleasure and contentment now, later, and in the next life. The purpose of those Vedic rituals was dharma, artha, and kama. The first 3 of the 4 Purusharthas. And the Jnana Kanda is for the sake of moksha, the 4th of those Purusharthas. If you're not familiar with this topic of the 4 Purusharthas, we discussed it at the end of the prior class. You can go back and listen to that. So with that in mind, here Sri Krishna is critical of those who focus on the karma kanda, seeking pleasure and contentment, and those who overlook the jnana kanda, which leads you to discover the true source of pleasure and contentment within. We'll have all that discussion will come. So let's resume. Yamimam pushpitam vacham, yamimam pushpitam vacham, pravadantya vipashchitaha, pravadantya vipashchitaha, vedavadarata partha, vedavadarata partha, Nanyadastiti vadinaha, nanyadastiti vadinaha. Good. Excuse me. Start in the third line. Partha, O Arjuna, he's addressed by Sri Krishna. Sri Krishna says, he's talking about those who are Veda, Vada, Rataha. Those who revel in the Vada, in the teaching of the Veda, and specifically in the Karma Kanda of the Veda. That's the context, you see it very clearly. So he's criticizing those who revel in the Karma Kanda of the Veda. He calls them in the second line, and avipashchitaha. They're not clear thinking. They haven't clearly discerned that the ultimate source of contentment and pleasure is within. And so, since they haven't discerned the true source within, they're focused out in the world, gaining happiness, contentment, peace, and joy through worldly activities, through worldly pursuits, supported by the performance of Vedic rituals. Vedic rituals are done to help you gain worldly goals. Let me say that again. Vedic rituals were done to help you gain worldly goals, dharma, artha, and kama. So Sri Krishna criticizes them. Those who are committed to the karma kanda of the Veda, they are avipashchitaha. They haven't properly discerned what's really going. They haven't properly discerned the true source of contentment within. And because they're ignorant, pravadanti, in the beginning of the second line, they say, they utter vacham in the first line. They utter imam vacham, these words. The imam, yam imam vacham. They utter such words that come from the Vedas, which Sri Krishna here calls pushpitam vacham, flowery words. Flowery words in a sense of very appealing words of the Vedas. So since the Karma Kanda says that by doing these rituals, you can go to heaven, you can attain, you can get the birth of a son, you can acquire wealth, these various worldly goals available through Vedic rituals. Sri Krishna calls all that pushpitam vacham, flowery words, and having criticized those who are committed to the Veda, to the Karma Kanda, he concludes, he says further in the fourth line, na anyat asti iti vadinaha. He says they are vadinaha. They are people who say what? Na anyat asti. Iti is like a close quote. Na anyat asti. There is nothing else. There is no other way. And I'll paraphrase now. There is no other way to gain contentment, joy, happiness, peace, love. There is no other way to gain these except through the performance of Vedic rituals. And this is what Sri Krishna is highly critical of. And he continues. Kamatmana swargapara, kamatmana swargapara, janma karma pada pala pradam, janma karma pala pradam, kriya vishesha bahulam, kriya vishesha bahulam, bhogaishvarya gatam prati, bhogaishvarya gatam prati. So those, speaking still about those who are committed to the karma kanda of the Vedas, those who are committed to this highly ritualistic form of the practice of Hinduism, he calls them in this verse kamatmanaha. those people, here Atma means heart or mind. Atma doesn't always mean Satchidananda Atma, your true self. Atma can simply mean yourself. And here it means mind. Kama Atmanaha, those whose minds are filled with kama, desire. What do they desire? They desire pleasure now, kama. They desire pleasure for the rest of their lives, artha. And they desire pleasure in whatever follows this life, dharma, the first three of the four purusharthas. And they are swarga paraha. They are para, focused on swarga, getting to heaven. Their ultimate goal is to get to heaven. They realize perhaps that the pleasure they can enjoy in this life is limited. As a human being, there's only so much pleasure you can enjoy, and there's a lot of suffering associated with a human birth. So they're focused on going to heaven and having a deva sharira, having a godly body, which is not going to be subject to suffering at all. So in heaven, they can have pleasure with no suffering. And you see a reference to that in the final line. We'll get there. Oh, in the final line, pick up that word prati. We need that word. Prati. They are towards, they're focused on. What are they focused on in the second line? They're focused on janma, karma, phala, pradam. The rituals which are pradam, the rituals which give karma, phala, the fruits of one's actions, and here the karma specifically is ritual. Karma phala is the result of Vedic rituals. And actually, a better way of interpreting this, the phala, and my translation here is helpful. So they want the phala of doing the rituals, and the phala of doing those rituals is twofold here. Janma, a better birth, specifically a birth in heaven, and karma, punya karma, religious merit. So they are focused, prati, they are focused on these rituals which bestow good karma and better rebirth. And those rituals are kriya, vishesha, bahulam. Those rituals are bahula. They're filled with vishesha, many specific kriya actions. There are many steps in those rituals, many parts. If you've watched a skilled Hindu priest performing a homa or a havan, a fire ritual, you see there are so many steps involved. So kriya, vishesha, bahulam, those rituals are filled with so many steps and parts to the rituals, and they are prati, they're focused on bhoga, aishwarya, gatim. They're focused on a gati, a goal. The goal was heaven, and the goal of heaven is a condition in which there is bhoga, pleasure, and aishwarya, power, sovereignty, absence of suffering. So they're focused on getting to heaven, as opposed to being focused on moksha. Moksha is reached through the fourth of those four purusharthas we discussed in the last class. I'll put them back up on the board a little later when we get to that part. Continuing. He's not done with his criticism of rituals. Bhogaishvarya prasaktanam, Bhogaishvarya prasaktanam, Tayapahrita chetasam, Tayapahrita chetasam, Vyavasayatmika buddhihi, Vyavasayatmika buddhihi, Samadhau na vidhiyate, Samadhau na vidhiyate. So the prior verse talked about bhoga, bhogaishwarya gatim, prati, those focused on bhoga, pleasure, and aishwarya, a power. So he's referring to those. Bhoga Aishwarya Prasaktanam. For those who are prasakta, attached to, dedicated to. Dedicated to what? Bhoga and Aishwarya, pleasure and power, which you gain by performing rituals and going to heaven. So about those, he says, Taya apahrita chetasam. Taya, by their attachment or by their ignorance, they are apahrita chetasam. Their chetas, their minds are apahrita, carried away. Their minds are carried away by their attachment to power and pleasure. Does that sound a little familiar? This is the human condition. So many people are riveted. Apahrita chetas, one whose mind is carried, literally carried away. Those whose minds are carried away by their attachment to power and pleasure. What about them? Sri Krishna says, for them, vyavasayatmika buddhihi na vidhiyate. Part of the last line. So vyavasayatmika buddhihi. Here, buddhi means an understanding, which is vyavasayatmika, which is well ascertained. We saw that expression in verse 41. So back right here, in top first line, vyavasayatmika buddhir, same expression. The buddhi and understanding, which is vyavasayatmika, we had a long discussion when we saw verse 41. In fact, it was a discussion of the four purusharthas. So we said, vyavasayatmika buddhihi, the well-ascertained understanding is the ascertainment, let me get this slide back, is the ascertainment that the pursuit of dharma, artha, and kama can never lead you to complete peace and uninterrupted contentment. I should have talked about this before. Let me mention it right now. Anything you achieve through karma, effort, whether it's a worldly effort, like going to work in the morning, or whether it's a ritual effort, doing complicated rituals, the results of any ritual, of any karma, any worldly karma or any religious karma, the results will always be limited, finite. So it means if you work really hard, you get a paycheck, but the paycheck is a finite amount. If you do lots of rituals, you collect religious merit, but the religious merit is a finite amount. With that finite paycheck, you can only buy a finite number of things. With that finite religious merit, you can perhaps go to heaven, but as many of you know, the Hindu concept of heaven is that when you exhaust all your religious merit, you get reborn again into another life. So the result of any karma, whether it be a worldly karma or a religious karma, is finite, it's limited. And the problem is, we want perfect peace. We want perfect contentment. A story I made up, I've told many times, I'll tell it right now, it fits in. I jokingly invented a medication, a pill. Suppose some scientist develops a pill, you take this medication, and you will be happy 99% of the time. By taking this medication, you'll be happy 99% of the time. Suppose I have that pill. Will you take it? Well, that would be a reasonable thing to do, because being happy 99% of the time is not bad, better than what you normally experience. But suppose the next time I see you is the 1% of the time when the medication doesn't make you happy. And I see you so miserable, and I ask you, what happened? I thought you took the pill. And you said, yeah, 99% of the time I'm happy. Right now I'm miserable. And here's the point. Can you accept being miserable 1% of the time when you're happy 99% of the time? Well, while you're in that 1% of misery, you can't accept it at all. We want perfect peace, perfect contentment, uninterrupted contentment. And that state of perfection cannot be accomplished through finite karmas. So finite worldly actions will not lead you to a state of perfect contentment and peace, and the finite rituals you do will never lead you to perfect peace and contentment. On the other hand, shifting your attention away from dharma, artha, and kama, shifting your attention towards the fourth purushartha, moksha, you are now seeking the true source of contentment and peace. And when you have found that true source of contentment and peace, you will in fact enjoy perfect, unbroken, uninterrupted contentment and peace. Vyavasayatmika buddhi is that discernment. The discernment of the fact that the pursuit of dharma, artha, and kama through any amount of effort, worldly effort and religious effort, you cannot possibly gain perfect, complete contentment and peace. It can only be achieved through seeking moksha, liberation, enlightenment. That discernment is vyavasayatmika buddhihi. And here in this verse, Sri Krishna says, for those who are attached to pleasure and power, for those whose minds are overcome by their attachment to pleasure and power, for them, vyavasayatmika buddhihi, this discernment of the limitation of what you can achieve through effort and the recognition of what you can gain by gaining moksha. That is for those people who are carried away by their attachment to pleasure and power, this discernment na vidhiyate. It will not arise in their minds. They will not. This discernment is like a transformation of priorities in life. Generally, do you have a to-do list? Many things you have to do, and maybe you prioritize your to-do list. So there are so many things to be done in life. Vyavasayatmika buddhi is the discernment where moksha, spiritual growth, is the number one goal. In your to-do list, it's number one. Other things also have to be done, and you'll continue to do all of those. But when seeking moksha is in the number one position on your to-do list, that is the proper discernment, vyavasayatmika buddhi. But for these people who are committed to Vedic rituals and going to heaven, that discernment, na vidhiyate, it will not arise for them. Samadhau. My translation here is it's not in keeping with the commentary of Madhusudana Saraswati, which I referred to when I prepared for class. So you can say it will never lead to samadhi. It's correct and it's meaningful. But Madhusudana Samadhi, as you know, is a state of meditative absorption, which is the common meaning of samadhi. But Madhusudana Saraswati, in his commentary, goes to the root meaning of samadhi, when you can break down the word into the root da, to place, with the prefixes some and a, some, a, da, to place well. Samadhi is, in one sense, it's a well-placed mind. In a meditative sense, you can kind of see how it gets that meaning. So a well-placed mind is a mind established in the absorption of samadhi. But the meaning Madhusudana takes here is samadhi, a mind which is well-placed in truth, well-placed in Brahman. This is how Madhusudana takes it. So he wouldn't like my translation, but that's there are several ways. I should mention there's several commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita, and they will interpret that word samadhi differently. So you can definitely translate it as I did here. In the absence of, if you are focused on doing Vedic rituals to go to heaven, you're not going to gain samadhi and gain enlightenment. Or, in the sense of Madhusudana's commentary, if you are focused on rituals, you will never gain the discernment and gain that enlightenment in which your mind is established in truth, established in Brahman. Okay, next. Traigunya Vishaya Veda, Traigunya Vishaya Veda, Nistraigunya Bhavarjuna, Nistraigunya Bhavarjuna, Nirdvandvo Nitya Sattvasto, Nirdvandvo Nitya Sattvasto, Niryoga Kshema Atmavan, Niryoga Kshema Atmavan. Traigunya Vishayaha Vedaha. Vedaha, the Vedas, the four Vedas. And remember, in context, he's referring specifically to the Karma Kanda of those three Vedas, the portion of the Vedas focused on ritual. He says those Vedas are Traigunya Vishayaha. The subject matter, Vishaya, the subject matter of those Vedas are Traigunya. You know of the three gunas. The three gunas are the pre-scientific way of understanding the world. In modern science, we understand the world in terms of matter and energy. In ancient times, they understood the world in terms of sattva, rajas, and tamas. So we can refer to the world as matter and energy, or we can refer to the world in terms of the three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas. So traigunya means worldly, that which is composed of sattva, rajas, tamas, the three gunas. Traigunya Vishaya Veda. Sri Krishna says the Vedas have as a subject matter that which is traigunya, that which is worldly. I'm smiling because there's nothing let me say this and then explain. There's nothing fundamentally spiritual about the performance of Vedic rituals. Now, understand, first of all, the word spiritual. The spiritual is a translation of the Sanskrit word adhyatmika, that which is focused on the true self, that which is focused on reality, that which is focused on gaining enlightenment. But Vedic rituals, as we saw before, are focused on gaining. The Vedic rituals are for the sake of dharma, artha, and kama. These three, I want to get them up on the board, so let me do that now, because we're going to need it later anyway. So I keep referring to these four purusharthas. We discussed them in a prior class, and I want to return to that. Now, so let me make sure I'm on the board. So the term purushartha, the artha, the goal of a purusha, person, there are 4 dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. And we discussed this at length in a prior class, but just to return to this really important teaching, we've said that kama is for the sake of contentment now. Kama means pleasure. Artha is gaining wealth which is necessary to enjoy contentment later in this life. And then dharma is the accumulation of religious merit so that whatever follows this life would be a condition of contentment. So we'll jokingly call that much later. But notice contentment and pleasure now, contentment and pleasure later, contentment and pleasure much later. How worldly is that? There's nothing spiritual about it. There is something religious about it because prayer is involved all the way through. So, but we distinguish between religion and spirituality. Religion is prayer and deals with matters of belief. Spirituality, as we use the word in Advaita Vedanta, it's used differently in other places, but in Advaita Vedanta, we refer to spirituality, as I said, it's a translation of the word adhyatmika. Sorry for the long Sanskrit word here. Adhyatmika. Adhyatmika literally means spiritual, and it gets its meaning. You can see the word atma inside. Focused on atma. Adhyatmika means focused on atma, pursuing truth. And pursuing truth where? Adhyatmika, within yourself. So here we can distinguish between an outward turned pursuit and an inward turned pursuit. This worldly pursuit, trigunya vishaya, that which is concerned with the world, is an outward turned pursuit, and that is a pursuit of dharma, artha, and kama, as opposed to an inward turned pursuit, which is the pursuit of absolute truth, which is the pursuit of moksha. So this is the key distinction in that vyavasayatmika buddhi, that discernment. That discernment is a radical shift of orientation, where your orientation shifts away from that which is external, in our verse called trigunya, worldly, and the shift is from the worldly to moksha, that which is otherworldly, that which is transcending the world. We'll come back to this in just, while I'm up here, let me just make one more comment, or one more connection that we discussed before. We said that the first 3 of these purusharthas are gained by following the karma kanda of the Veda, as opposed to moksha, which is gained by following, we saw this last week also, by following the jnana kanda of the Veda. Okay, this is extremely important material. Okay. Am I back? Good. So now, Sri Krishna begins by saying, Trigunya Vishaya Vedaha. Here Veda means the karma kanda of the Veda. And as we just saw, the karma kanda of the Veda has the subject matter which is trigunya, worldly. The pursuit of dharma, artha, and kama is a worldly pursuit. And then comes the very powerful direction to Arjuna. In the third line, he addresses Arjuna by name. Arjuna, O Arjuna, nistraigunya bhava. Bhava, you should be nistraigunya, free from the three gunas, literally free from the three gunas, but contextually free from worldliness, free from the pursuit of dharma, artha, and kama, and you should be free from that and obviously focused on moksha is the sense here. Excuse me. Traigunya Vishaya Vedaha. The karma kanda of the Veda is concerned with worldly matters. So therefore, Arjuna, nistraigunya bhava. O Arjuna, you should be free from worldly matters, meaning you should reject the karma kanda of the Veda. This is very powerful. Rejection of the excessive ritualism of ancient times, some of which persists even to this day. He continues to tell Arjuna that Arjuna bhava, you should be nirdvandvaha, free from these dualities. And here, dvandva means a pair, and a pair, they're generally called pairs of opposites. You've got pleasure and pain, cold and heat, these opposites where you seek one and want to avoid the other. You seek pleasure, you want to avoid pain. That's kind of the basic rule of life. But if you remember, I think in the last class we discussed how the problem is one of compulsivity. We need to return to this. Won't make any sense unless we return to that teaching we discussed before. And the difference between likes and dislikes and binding likes and dislikes, or raga and dvesha. We've said in a prior class that having likes and dislikes is normal. When he says nirdvandvaha, be free from these likes and dislikes, does it mean anything is okay? That's unnatural. I gave the example that my own guru prefers coffee over tea. Having been born in South India, he grew up drinking coffee. He also drank tea, but he had a preference for coffee. The point is having likes and dislikes is normal. It is not the problem. The problem is when you get compulsive about it, where you have to get what you like and you have to avoid what you dislike. The problem is not likes and dislikes. The problem is being emotionally compelled to seek what you like and being compelled to avoid what you don't like. The problem is compulsivity. And when he says, nirdvandvaha bhava, O Arjuna, you should be free from these pairs. You should be impartial is a literal translation. You should be free from these pairs. The context is you should be free from this compulsivity. You should be nitya sattvastaha. You should be always established in sattva, a state of purity. What he's referring to here is a state of mind in which you can break free from pursuing dharma, artha, and kama, and instead pursue moksha. The problem is a problem that's well known to you, and that is we only have so much time available in each day. And if 100% of our time is engaged in dharma, artha, and kama, how much time is available for seeking moksha? That's the problem. So the instruction to Arjuna, nistraigunyaha, turn your back on seeking these worldly goals, dharma, artha, and kama. And turn your back means not to ignore them completely, because you have to live in the world unless you become a sannyasi, a Hindu monk, and live in an ashram or a cave. You have to be involved in worldly activities. But as I said before, the trick is to make moksha the number one priority. And that's the message being given to Arjuna here. Nirdvandvaha. Break free of this conventional worldly pursuit of chasing after what you want and running away from what you don't want. Nitya sattvastaha. Always be established in a state of mental purity where your mind is available to pursue moksha. Nir yoga kshemaha. Be free from, there's a common expression, yoga and kshema. Here, yoga has nothing to do with what you commonly understand as yoga. In this expression, yoga means getting what you want, and kshema means preserving what you've attained. Yoga is a state of getting what you want. Kshema is the state of preserving it. So yoga is getting the cup of tea. Kshema is not spilling it so that you can enjoy it. So the life is characterized as yoga and kshema, acquisition of what you want, and kshema, protection or preservation of what you've gained. And here, Sri Krishna says, break free from that. Break free from this conventional worldly attitude so that you can focus on gaining moksha. And he ends that sentence by saying, Arjuna, you should be Atmavan. Literally, Atmavan, possessed of Atma. But what does that mean? I said before, who is not possessed of an Atma? Everyone has Atma. Atma here doesn't mean Satchidananda. Here, Atma simply means self. Atmavan means self-possessed. And in our context, we could say being internally focused. We distinguished between being externally focused in the pursuit of dharma, artha, and kama, externally focused in the pursuit of those worldly goals, as opposed to being internally focused for the sake of gaining moksha. That condition of being internally focused is called here Atmavan, literally self-possessed. Now, to introduce the next verse, let's just get the context here. Suppose you have, let me introduce it properly. Suppose you have undergone this transformation of priorities and intent, so that you're no longer focused exclusively on pursuing dharma, artha, and kama. Your primary focus in life is moksha. That's the vyavasayatmika buddhi, the discernment we discussed before. Suppose you have gained that discernment. Having gained that discernment, what would be your perspective on all these Vedic rituals? Here, Sri Krishna is concluding his criticism of all those Vedic rituals. So for one who has made this, where am I? Here. I have to come back. For one who has made that shift of intent, that shift of shifting one's goal, shifting one's orientation from that external orientation to the internal orientation, from that external worldly orientation to this internal spiritual orientation. For such a person who has made that discernment, what would be their attitude towards Vedic rituals? And that's what Sri Krishna describes quite wonderfully. in this next verse. Yavan harta hudapane, yavan harta hudapane, sarvata samplutodake, sarvata samplutodake, tavan sarveshu vedeshu, tavan sarveshu vedeshu, brahmanasya vijanataha, brahmanasya vijanataha. And that last line, vijanataha, for one who understands properly. Brahmana here doesn't necessarily mean one who belongs to that caste, but rather one who's pursuing Brahman. It's another meaning of Brahmana. Several meanings of Brahmana. One, of course, is the caste, but another meaning often used in Vedanta is one who pursues Brahman, absolute reality. So Brahmanasya vijanataha, for that one who has the proper discernment, for one who has discerned the limitation of worldly pursuits, for one who has shifted the orientation away from external pursuits and towards internal pursuit of truth, for such a person, what is their attitude towards Vedic rituals? Well, Sri Krishna gives this metaphor. Yavan artaha udapane. Yavan, as much artaha, as much value, udapane. Udapana is a well, a source of water. A well which is sarvataha, on all sides, sampluta udake. Udaka is water. A well which is sampluta udake, sarvataha, a well which is on all sides surrounded by water. And here we need to understand the metaphor. In dry parts of India and other places, it's not uncommon for villagers to dig a well in a dry stream bed. And the reason you might dig a well in a dry stream bed is stream bed means water. So you might presume that the water would be closer to the surface in that dry stream bed. So imagine villagers dig a well in that dry stream bed and they have access to water. That is their udapana. Their well is in that dry stream bed. But then suppose when the rains come, in July and August, September, the heavy rains come, and it rains so much that the dry stream bed is no longer dry. It's now running with water. Now, picture it, the villagers built that well in the middle of that dry stream bed, but now the well is surrounded by water all over the place, and Sri Krishna uses this metaphor. What is the use of that well when the well is surrounded by water? You don't need to go to the well. You just go to the stream and you get as much water as you want. So the point is that the well becomes superfluous, is the right word. The well becomes superfluous. So this is what Sri Krishna is teaching here. It says, Yavan arta udapane, as much value as one has for a well, which is sarvata sampluta udake, for that well which is surrounded all over the place by water, for that well in the stream bed when the stream is flowing with water. Tavan, so that you recognize that the well is superfluous. That is the value of the well. Yavan arta. The value of the well is that the well is superfluous. Tavan, that much is the value, sarveshu vedeshu, in all the Vedas. And again, he's specifically referring to the karma kanda of the Veda. Just as the well becomes superfluous when the rains come, in the same way, the performance of Vedic rituals becomes superfluous, and the teachings of the Karma Kanda become superfluous for one when you have undergone that shift of orientation, when you have that vyavasayatmika buddhi, when you have that discernment that the pursuit of limited worldly goals is not worth it. It's not worth the effort. With that discernment, you turn your orientation away from worldly pursuits. You turn your orientation within. Brahmanasya vijanataha. For one who has made this discernment, just as the well surrounded by water is superfluous, in the same way, the ritualism taught in the Vedas becomes superfluous, having made that shift of orientation. And we'll end our class now, but I just want to show you the verse with which we'll begin our next class, Karmanyevadikaraste. With this verse, Sri Krishna begins to teach what karma yoga is. So far, he's been teaching what it is not. And he's been teaching the shift of orientation, which is the basis for karma yoga. I'll explain that in the next class, and we'll see this very important verse. Om sarve bhavantu sukhinaha sarve santu niramayaha sarve bhadrani pashyantu ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhaveta asato ma sadgamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityor ma amritangamaya. Om shanti shanti shanti. Om. That's it.